Hi, and thanks very much for joining me. Now in this video I want to carry on looking at social issues in the 1960s during the time of Harold Wilson's government, and I want to focus on immigration today. Before we really look during the period 1964 to 1970, it's worth looking at what the situation was like during the 1950s, so building up to 1964. And to help us go through that, what I'm going to do is bring up a slide and we're just going to talk through the key points that you're going to see on that slide in front of you. And what you see, following World War II, immigration in the UK increased, and the migrant workers that are travelling from the Commonwealth, from the Caribbean, from across Asia to Britain, are helping to rebuild Britain after the war. A symbol of this is Empire Windrush, the boat which sails from the Caribbean in 1948, carrying 492 migrant workers. Now by 1958 you've got almost 250,000, 210,000 Commonwealth migrants have settled in Britain. Public attitudes to this are mixed. You've got feelings of tolerance, i.e. acceptance, but also there's outright racism. There's people who are not happy, people who have this perception that they're taking British jobs, people who have this perception that they're somehow eroding Britishness, whatever that is. But look at this in the round. In the 1950s, 676,000 migrants seek residence in Britain. However, 1.32 million Britons are actually leaving, seeking a new life abroad, in places like Australia, places like Canada. 1958, the Notting Hill riots take place. Notting Hill being an area in London. White youths are starting to target black communities who are living in that area. And this escalates to the point where black youths retaliate, and in the end the police are involved. And riots break out. There are no two ways about this. The black community in that area are being targeted, they are not supported by the police, they are feeling oppressed, they are feeling a very, very threatened group of people, and riots break out. And then in 1962 the Commonwealth Immigrants Act is passed, and this is an attempt to restrict the number of Commonwealth citizens who are migrating to Britain. So that gives you an idea of the situation in 1950s up to 1964. As always, I'm a big fan of using historians, of looking at what they've got to say during that period, and I've been using Dominic Sam's book throughout. His White Heath book is really useful for this period, and so we'll have a look at what he's got to say about this period in history. And Dominic Sam's book says, all of these anxieties played into the hands of the racist far right. Organisations like the British Ku Klux Klan, the English Rights Association and the Racial Preservation Society began to pick up recruits, while the press reported increasing violence against immigrants and their families. In February 1967, activists formed the National Front, which drew on an underground heritage of British fascism and placed a heavy emphasis on immigration issue. The National Front was most popular in areas where it could exploit existing anti-immigration sentiment, and it probably owed most to the example of groups like the Southall Residents Association and the Birmingham Immigration Control Association. By 1969, so the party claimed, membership inquiries had reached some 180 a week. So Sam Brooke gives us a real clear understanding of the tone of how the public were responding to immigration during that period, and this idea that residents' associations were formed very simply on racist terms to try and limit immigration. Now what I want to look at is events that takes place following the independence of Kenya. Kenya became independent in 1963. Yet following that, the Kenyan government starts to impose a number of laws within their country which limit the access, limit the ability for immigrants in Kenya to take jobs and to own businesses. This sees a growing number of Commonwealth citizens who previously lived in Kenya starting to seek life in the United Kingdom. And what we see during the spring of 1968, a growing number of immigrants starting to arrive in Great Britain. And we're looking at a figure of about 2,000 a month. These immigrants are arriving, they are legally entitled to be in this country. They are Commonwealth citizens. Yet a growing number of people, a growing number of MPs, and we'll look at one in particular soon, Enoch Powell, are starting to raise concerns, are starting to question this. And so in March 1968, the government passes legislation to limit the number of Commonwealth immigrants who can arrive in the UK. And this brings that number down to 1,500 a year. That leaves a huge number of immigrants now effectively stateless. They're no longer welcome in Kenya, they're no longer able to return to Britain, and they've left their homes back in India, back in Asia some time ago. That legislation though proves to be popular with the general public, and 70% of people agree with the government decision to limit immigration. At the same time, or just afterwards, in April 1968, Enoch Powell gives what is really his most infamous speech and one of the most contentious speeches of British post-war political history, and it's described as his Rivers of Blood speech. He gives a speech to a Conservative association, a Conservative group, and I just want to look at an extract of that speech now. And Enoch Powell says, "We must be mad, literally mad, to allow the annual inflow of 50,000 dependents. So insane are we that we actually permit unmarried persons to immigrate for the purpose of founding families with spouses they have never seen. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman prophet, I see the Tiber foaming with much blood." Now, Enoch Powell's words were clearly inflammatory. There's a lot of emotion in those words. There's a lot of tension that is being built up. Now, purely looking at that as a source, as an A-level history student, it is worth looking at the value of that, the content of it, the tone, the provenance. All of that is useful stuff. However, what I want to now consider are the ramifications. What's the result of this speech? Well, first of all, Edward Heath, who is leader of the Conservative Party, immediately sacks Enoch Powell from his position as Shadow Defence Secretary. Edward Heath never speaks to Enoch Powell again. However, 72% of the public support Enoch Powell's words, and you see dockers, about 1,000 dockers in London, march on Whitehall in favour of Enoch Powell. So we're seeing this growing, or certainly very present and very vocal racist view in Britain in the 1960s. So what we need to do is now start looking at legislation. What did the government do to counter this growing view, to deal with the growing racism that the immigrant community are facing in Britain during that period? You can see in front of you there are two key pieces of legislation that the government bring in. The first one is the 1965 Race Relations Act, and it's the first piece of legislation in the UK which addresses racial discrimination. The Act bans racial discrimination in public places, and it makes the promotion of racial hatred on grounds of colour, race, ethnicity or national origin an offence. At the same time, the Race Relations Board is set up, and they will be given powers to investigate complaints of racial discrimination. The Race Relations Board will be formally established in 1966. Following on from that, in 1968 we see a further Race Relations Act. Now, where the 1965 Act was looking at racial discrimination in public places, this now looks at discrimination in private places, in terms of housing, insurance and employment, and also the powers of the Race Relations Board are strengthened. So it's really important to identify that Wilson's government make clear efforts to start resolving the issues of racial tension, of racial discrimination with two pieces of legislation, two Race Relations Act and the formation of the Race Relations Board. The Race Relations Board isn't wholly successful. Many of the cases it investigates don't go all the way through to a full complaint. That's because many people feel that it doesn't have the power to compel people to attend as witnesses, and also not everybody complains to them because they feel that it's just a waste of time. However, it is a very clear step in the right direction. It's also now worth thinking about the wider social changes that immigration brings. Perhaps the most obvious one is on the high street in terms of restaurants. We see more Indian restaurants, we see more Chinese restaurants, we see this idea of ethnic cuisine starting to arrive on the high street, and more people, as they are having this food, start to understand this wider culture. Now, whilst on the face of it that doesn't seem a big step forwards, it clearly is a positive step, this acceptance of different ideas, different cultures. In addition, we start to see a new range of fashion and music start being brought into mainstream culture in Great Britain. This is combined with moves such as bands like the Beatles, who go off to India and bring back ideas such as meditation and yoga. So we see a widening of culture. So within society, you've got two arguments here. You've got this racist view, these residents' associations, Enoch Powell and others like that, who are very anti-immigration, yet we've got the government who are bringing in race relations legislation and the wider, more positive social changes that take place at the same time. Now finally, to bring that all together, what I've done is created a timeline, which again I will show you now, and then you can follow all of this through. And you see on the timeline how the first Race Relations Act is passed in 1965. We see the formation of the Race Relations Board. Then in 1968, this influx of Commonwealth immigrants from Kenya. The Commonwealth Immigration Act passed as a response to that, March 1968. Enoch Powell giving his Rivers of Blood speech in April 68. And then finally the second Race Relations Act passed, 1968. So there it is, immigration during the period of Harold Wilson's government, 1964 to 1970. As always, I'll add some more videos covering this period. Click on subscribe, follow those. Otherwise, thanks very much. Bye bye.